Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the University of the Witwatersrand's Fossil Hominid Vault here in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Lee Berger, a professor in paleoanthropology here at the university and an explorer at large for the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm going to give you a sneak peek at some of the most important fossils discovered here in South Africa and, in fact, in Africa from one of the longest-running excavations in all of history. They come from, of course, the site of Sterkfontein, just outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. And today, the goal of this lecture is to just give you a little bit of look at the context of some of these remarkable fossils and a look at the history of Sterkfontein. I'll be doing more lectures in the future, looking at specific parts of the anatomy, the postcranial, and comparing the variation at Sterkfontein to explore whether there are one, two, or even more species in the many deposits of that site. The site has a long history associated both with Johannesburg in general as well as with the science of paleoanthropology. It was first visited in 1898 by a group of students and staff from the Marist Brothers College here in Johannesburg, but that wasn't a scientific excavation. It would then begin to be excavated for lime in much the way that all of these sites have, miners looking for calcium carbonate to use in the gold industry and to build the buildings here in South Africa. So lots of dynamite was used in the extraction of rock. And it was soon realized that fossils were in these rocks. The first scientific visit was by Trevor Jones in 1935, where he collected a few fossils. But the most important visit came in August of 1936 when Robert Broom, along with a couple of other individuals, visited the site. It was August 8th, and he met the foreman, G.W. Barlow, who was working at the site. Now, there's a remarkable little segue there. Barlow was actually working at the Taung site when the Taung fossil was discovered. Broom asked him to look for fossils, like the Taung child, and if he ever found any, to contact him. And it was 8 days later that Mr. Barlow showed Broom a fossil endocast. In fact, this is a cast of that fossil endocast, and said famously, "Is this what you're after?" Well, indeed it was. This was the fossil endocast, just like the Taung child's one, and that's probably why Barlow recognized it for what it was. They soon went to where it was found, and they could see that there was the rest, and this really is a real mush, but would become known as TM 1511, TM standing for Transvaal Museum specimen number 1511. That would start off Broom's work and interest at the site. They would originally call these fossils Australopithecus transvaalensis, the Transvaal being the old name for this region around the Witwatersrand. It would later be subsumed into a thing called Plesioanthropus due to fossils like this being discovered, which is, of course, the famous Mrs. Ples. Now, it's important to note I'm showing you casts right now. The reason I am is the Sterkfontein collection is actually divided into two spaces. One at the Transvaal Museum, or what's now called the Taung Museum in Tshwane or Pretoria, South Africa. Those are all the earlier fossils that are collected by Broom and Robinson and others prior to 1966. And then there's the 1966 and onwards collection that we hold here. So the fossils that are held in Pretoria are known either as TM numbers for the very early ones, Transvaal Museum numbers, or STS numbers for Sterkfontein type site. That's where the area where Mrs. Ples was actually discovered. Most of the fossils in Pretoria were found in very hard concrete-like breccia. Most of the older fossils from here were found in decalcified sediments, and we'll look at those in a little bit. The work really began to slow down at Sterkfontein after 1948 when the National Party came to power, and they began following the sort of rules and dictates of the Dutch Reformed Church. But a lot of science went on in the 1950s around these fossils, and it was then that John Robinson subsumed most of the fossils that had been discovered into the same genus and species as the Taung child, Australopithecus africanus. In 1966, my mentor Philip Tobias reopened the site, along with Alan Hughes, who is a name you'll hear a lot as I go through this. Alan Hughes was the site foreman and excavated, along with Simon Sekoe, most of the fossils that we're going to be looking at today. Something like 600 fossils are in this collection, a vast collection. But it's also, I'll warn you up front, a very fragmented collection. Because of the nature of how the fossils were deposited, first in caves, they were first solidified into concrete-like substances that we call breccia. They were put under great compression, and then they were decalcified over time. That means the calcium carbonate was removed by various means, including trees, water percolation, and in fact, likely termites, decalcifying the sediments. That's where most of the fossils that we have in this collection come from, but most of the more complete fossils come out of the hard breccia because they've yet to be sort of disarticulated by the decalcification process. So let's look at a few of those now. Let's start with a skull. This skull is STW 505. STW stands for Sterkfontein Witwatersrand, and that's how all the fossils that are labeled from the 1966 onward excavations are labeled. This skull comes from hard breccia. It was actually removed from in situ with blasting methods and then prepared out using actually very crude methods initially. They used to use hammer and chisels, small hammers and chisels, to remove it, later moving to what we call air scribes, which are fine percussive instruments that don't actually touch the bone, a much preferred method to removing those. More modern methods look at using CT scans, both clinical but more recently micro and even synchrotron scans like those at the ESRF in Grenoble, France, to actually scan these, so we can often leave rock around them. But at the time that this came out, those methods didn't exist, and so they were prepared completely, leaving none of the adhering breccia. This is thought to be a male Australopithecus africanus. You can see the beautiful face, and I'll bring that into focus in a variety of positions so you can look at it. As we turn it in sideways, you can see the endocast, the supraorbital ridge, but notice that there's no sagittal crest across the top. That is, they don't have the crest like the robust Australopithecines. And this very broad face is one of the larger individuals ever discovered. Let me bring Mrs. Ples into side with this one so that you can actually see them side by side in this image, and you can see that 505 is significantly larger. It also has a larger brain cast. This brain cast is probably somewhere in the area of 450 to 500 cubic centimeters. That's an interesting question that someone asked me online. How do you estimate the endocast volume? It's harder than you think. Often there's distortion. Here you can see distortion of this specimen, and the midline is often hard to identify, so you aren't able to actually just double the volume that you had. But the calculations on this one say it's one of the larger brain-sized individuals, likely around 450, maybe over 500 cubic centimeters, just over, maybe as high as 520 cubic centimeters of cranial capacity for these. Now, I'm not going to do a lot of anatomy today because I'm going to be doing detailed comparative anatomy when we look at the species questions around the Sterkfontein assemblage, whether there's one or more species there a little bit later on. This is really just to give you an idea of the type of fossils that we have and the quality of their preservation. Here you can still see some of the limestone attached to this, and at some time in the future that may be useful for direct dating this fossil in particular. Not all the fossils from Sterkfontein are as easy to see. That's actually a face, and I'll try to align it so that you can see it. Orbit, and then this very crushed area, which is the maxilla, the front of the face. And here you can see the teeth of this individual. Luckily, unlike 505, the teeth are part of the teeth are intact, but you can see that they are very crushed and damaged within this specimen, which is numbered STW13. Now, by that very low number, you can tell that this fossil came out very early in the work, close to 1967, 68, and thus was a very important find because it was the first very good fossil of the sort of modern era of work at Sterkfontein. Not all the fossils are as distorted as 505 and STW13, thankfully. In the 1980s, Alan Hughes had extended the excavations, and it actually moved into a central area where he found a large decalcified area away from the type site. The type site was where Mrs. Ples had come from and others. And in the decalcified material, as I said, that material that had come out of, had been first like that, very solid and concrete-like, had then been decalcified by various measures, you began to find much better specimens coming out because they didn't have to be prepared. It didn't have adhering matrix to them like these. And here you can see a beautiful mandible. This is STW327. I'll be talking about that when I get to the variation. Notice the color difference immediately. The fossils that come from the hard etches are often gray and mottled with this black is, by the way, manganese. The ones that come from the decalcified, they too have manganese on them, but they don't tend to have that lighter grayish color, probably due to the decalcification process that goes on. You'll see various degrees of that staining and color differentiation as I go through that. You can see here we have a erupting second molar that has just erupted. Here's a first molar with very little wear on it, interestingly. And then here's a P4, a fourth premolar permanent dentition. That means this is a young individual. It's a juvenile individual because it is yet to erupt its last adult tooth. The third molar, which you can see on CT scan, is actually inside of the crypt right here. Sometimes the teeth aren't white like that specimen. Here is another specimen where you can see the M3 erupted now, so this is a full adult. It's got all of its permanent dentition. There's the M2 that's beginning to wear fairly significantly, but here the teeth are all this brilliant black. Really, really just beautiful specimens. Some of these specimens are just almost works of art in their preservation. I'll bring back 327. This is STW 109, by the way. I'll bring them back and hold them in anatomical position together, so you can see the difference between both the coloration and the preservation in these two fossils. Yet they come from not too distant from each other within the swallow pit or in the center of this area. We also find postcrania. This was a very, very important specimen that was discovered very early on, STW8. STW8 is, of course, part of a spinal cord. You can see by its color and see that it's all articulated and attached together here. Articulation, by the way, just means that things are in or near their original lifetime anatomical position. And you can see that this lumbar region is in its near anatomical position and actually shows some signs of lordosis or spinal curvature, and that was very exciting, indicating bipedalism in these specimens. One interesting thing, and I'm going to do an entire talk on the science of taphonomy and how these fossils preserve, but one of the things that this signals is, of course, that there was organic material left. There were ligaments, perhaps skin. There was perhaps solidified muscle when this specimen was eventually buried, and that's the only way that this could actually happen. That's going to be really important as we look at some of the fossils in the future. To contrast that, let's look at one that came out of the decalcified material. Here's a proximal ulna. and you can see the different coloration on this specimen. The ulna, by the way, is your elbow here, one of the two bones in your elbow, the radius being the other. But here you can see the very different preservation. And again, it's an interesting artifact of this, that often the material that didn't have to be prepared mechanically is in better condition than material that had to be prepared mechanically, and some of that obviously is the preparation method itself. Nature prepared better than we did in the earlier days of paleoanthropology. I'm going to reach over and bring this specimen out, and you're going to be surprised when I call this a specimen. But it's one specimen here. Within this tray is a juvenile specimen that has sometimes been assigned to the genus Homo. And again, we'll talk about the difference between Australopithecines, Homo at this site, possible other species a little later. The reason I wanted to show this to you, and I'm going to sort of tilt the tray up so you can get a look at it. This was all found clustered together, and has been and can be re-articulated into a single child, a very, very young child, both with deciduous teeth present as well as permanent dentition erupting, and actually forms a mandible and a maxilla of this one specimen that we call STW 151. I want to show this to you because you understand the complexity of trying to put this ultimate jigsaw puzzle back together. Not an easy job. Jacopo Mojicecchi has done a fantastic reconstruction of this, where you can see all of these in position. Of course, digital modeling now allows us to do quite a lot more with these specimens than we were able to in the past. Now I'm going to bring parts of a articulated skeleton over. This is STW 431. I'm going to be doing a whole discussion on STW 431, which is one of the very, very few partial skeletons that we have from this site. Here is a proximal radius, a proximal ulna, as you can see, and this specimen was found together, relatively together, scattered over a few meters, and thus we are fairly confident it represents a single specimen. There is obviously, when these were excavated, they were excavated using older methods, using spits and using a grid system. And what that did was it created a situation where the location of some of these was perhaps not kept as well as they should have been. And so when you map this out, it comes over a larger distance, but it's fairly clear when you look at things like the pelvis and other aspects of this specimen that it was all together or very close together when it was originally recovered. This is a beautiful arm here, which played an important part in Henry McHenry and my work on long arms and short legs in this species, something I will do a special discussion on a little bit later. And to give you an idea of what vertebra look like when they come out of the decalcified material, even though they would have likely been in articulation originally, here you can see a set of these vertebra in place, the lumbar region going down, but you can see that the decalcification process had broken them apart in different ways, different to other specimens like these, which were like STW8, which were in articulation at the time of discovery. Let's look at other parts of STW 431. Here is the sacrum, actually quite a rare bone to find. It's your tailbone that sits between the wings of your pelvis, and we have, in fact, parts of the pelvis that are here. Here's the ilium. Here's where the femur fits in to the acetabulum here, and parts of the other side of this pelvis form the bowl shape that we looked at when we looked at some of the Makapan-Scott fossils. You can see that there's these white areas on this bone, on this fossilized bone, and those white areas are plaster that previous researchers used to actually hold these together. We don't do that anymore. That's something that's frowned upon, because once it's done in plaster, it can never be undone, and thus you're left with the permanent record of the scientist that originally did the reconstruction. And given that we have digital technology, of course, that's no longer necessary. 431 is, of course, the beautiful skeleton. I would say that we probably have about 25% of that specimen. What is missing are lots of its ribs. Those are likely just unrecognized within the assemblage of the hundreds of thousands of fossils that have actually come from Sterkfontein. Let's take a look at some of the other beautiful specimens. This specimen, and you notice as people began working, the boxing system changed. This boxing system was actually very undesirable because the bones can actually rattle around in them. As these fossils are studied anew, we are beginning to transfer them into these sort of plastic boxes, which is a lot better for the specimens. They don't rattle around as much, and they're protected for longer. I'm just going to briefly show you 498. Very interesting fossil, and very interesting, and will be interesting particularly as we begin to look at whether there are one or two species. Here you can see a very large toothed individual. It's a young adult. The M3 has just come through. Here you can see it here. M2, M1, fourth premolar. What's cool about this is this was a skull, and we have quite a lot of this skull, and it's being reconstructed, but it's not in a very happy state. At least the top of it isn't. Believe it or not, that is the face of this individual. You can see the nasal opening here. When I turn it over, maybe it's a little easier to see the dentition. There's a very large canine for a hominid here, and then a third and fourth premolar that sits right here, so that we're looking at part of a very, very crushed face. So this was a specimen that had been calcified. It's still held together in parts by calcium carbonate. It was probably a whole skull and mandible together, and then it disarticulated apart as it decalcified. Let's take a look at the mandible of this specimen. Here is the left side of this mandible that I was just showing you, and here is, unfortunately, the right side of that same mandible, all crushed completely. You can see how the bone and teeth are mashed together. It literally looks like a rock fell on this specimen. And that's probably what happened at some time in the cave's history. Here's a very old individual, very large-toothed individual, and just to give you a comparison of that to some of the smaller individuals that we have, and that will come into the kind of ideas of the questions of, are there one or two species within the Sterkfontein assemblage? These specimens will play an important role in that. An important thing to understand about Sterkfontein is that it's mostly represented by fragments, and most of those are isolated teeth. It's something like 80% of the assemblage is represented by isolated teeth. So that gives you an idea of the limitations of working with this material and the value of some of these more complete specimens, and why they have become so important to paleoanthropology. You may be surprised at some of these specimens like 505 and 13. You may never have heard of them. Most of them have not been published in detail until very, very recently. Philip Tobias's initial work at the site was very explicitly to understand the context of earlier discoveries, but to also date the site. And so his priority, it appears, was not to describe these fossils. And so when I came here in the early 1990s, I opened up a vault that represented at that time probably 20% of the entire fossil record of early hominids in Africa, most of which were undescribed. Most of them have been described in either some level of detail to date, and that is critically important for understanding the anatomy and variation in species like Australopithecus africanus. So how old are these fossils? Well, the fossils I've been showing you today have all come from the classical member 4 deposits. And member 4 is thought to be about 2.1 to 2.5 or 2.6 million years old. Now, that's a long time for an accumulation to be made, and that may account for some of the variation that we're seeing in these fossils. But I'll talk more about variation and the potential of multiple species in later lectures. Well, that's all for today's lecture. Just an introduction to the fossils of Sterkfontein and a little bit about the history of the site. In future lectures, we'll be going into detail about whether there are more than one species at Sterkfontein. We'll look at some of the lesser known deposits and fossils that come from the site, as well as some of the more famous ones in greater detail. For now, I'll say goodbye from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg's Fossil Hominid Vault. I'm Lee Berger. You can follow me on Twitter at Lee R. Berger, or like my Facebook page, Prof. Lee R. Berger. Be safe out there, everyone. Keep washing those hands.